Welcome to the video covering the axial skeleton. If you remember, the axial skeleton includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the bony thorax or rib cage. We will cover the skull in a different video. This one will include the vertebral column and the bony thorax. Let's look at the vertebral column first. If you look at the vertebral column or spine, it is 26 irregular bones. There are 24 vertebrae and then a sacrum and a coccyx. If you look at it here, and if you look at it from the front, it looks very straight. But if you look at it from the side or lateral view, there are curvatures. As we count the vertebrae and look at them, first there are the cervical vertebrae, and there are 7 of those. And they're numbered or named C1 to C7. The curvature here is concave. The second division is the thoracic, and there are 12 vertebrae here, and they're named T1 to T12. The curvature here is convex. The next section is the lumbar, and there are 5 vertebrae here. They're numbered L1 to L5, and the curvature here is concave. The next bone is 5 fused vertebrae. In children, it's 5 separate vertebrae, but in the adult, those fuse together. The curvature here is convex. And then the last one is a coccyx, and the coccyx is 4 fused vertebrae. In children, it's also unfused. So if you look at it, it looks like this. I mentioned from the front, it should look very straight. There should be no lateral curvature. But if you look at it from the side, you can see these curvatures. It goes from concave to convex to concave to convex. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, and an easy way to remember this is breakfast at 7. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and an easy way to remember this is lunch at 12. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae, and an easy way to remember this is dinner at 5. And then if you add the sacrum and coccyx together, those fused bones, you wind up with a total of 9. And most people go to bed around 9. So breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5, bedtime at 9. Let's look at a single vertebrae. So if you look at a vertebra, it looks like this. And there's some things that all vertebrae share. Let's go over these. So the picture to the left, we're looking at a lateral view. The picture to the right, we're looking at a superior view. So let's start with the fact that they all have a body. Sometimes the body is called the centrum, but all vertebrae have a body. And if you notice, there are only a couple things attached to the body compared to everything else. Another thing all vertebrae have is they have a pointy sort of thing that sticks out posteriorly. These are called the spinous processes. And if you think about the bumps as you look down someone's back, you can see these. These are those spinous processes. We also have processes which stick out laterally, sort of like an outstretched arms. These stretch out or are in the transverse position, and so they're called transverse processes. There's also a hole in the center of every vertebra that the spinal cord goes through. This is called the vertebral foramen. Remember, foramen is the word for hole in a bone. If you look on either side of the foramen, what you're going to see are the things that are attached to the body, and these are the only things that are attached to the body. They're called pedicles. Pedicle means foot or legs, so they're like legs sticking out. We also have, going toward each other in sort of a diagonal shape, above the vertebral column, you can see them here, these are called laminae. And so the laminae fuse to form the spinous process. If we look over here at the lateral view, we can also see that there are processes that project upwards. And so they're called superior. They attach to the vertebra above, so they're called articulating. So the name of these is superior articulating processes. There are also processes that go down toward the vertebra below and articulate with that vertebra. So these are inferior articulating processes. So we can find all of these parts on every vertebra. Well, we're going to look at the individual divisions because each division or each type of vertebra has its own unique things. And so there's a table here to give you the list, and you can come back to this table and look at it. There's also pictures here of cervical vertebra. So how can we tell cervical vertebra from all the others? Well, it's actually quite easy. Remember, there's 7 of them, and they're just numbered C1 to C7. C1 also is called the atlas, and C2 is also called the axis. So if we look at those, it looks like this. So here are a typical vertebra and the atlas and axis. Well, the way we can tell cervical vertebra is that they have holes in their transverse process, and they're the only vertebrae that do this. Remember, the word for hole is foramen, and so they have transverse foramen in their transverse processes. There's an artery that runs through here up each side of the back of your neck to help nourish and send oxygen to blood to your brain. Those are called vertebral arteries. So the vertebral arteries only run through the cervical vertebrae. Well, if you look at cervical vertebrae, remember there are 7 of them, but the first 2 also actually have another name. So C1 also called the atlas and C2 also called the axis, and you can see them here. So let's look at this atlas and axis. There's a couple of things that they have that are unique to them. Remember, they have a vertebral foramen, but they also have some unique things. Let's look at the atlas. So when we look at the atlas, there's something missing here. There's something here that is not found but is on every other vertebra, and that is the body. There's no body on the atlas. And so what happens is during embryological and fetal development, the body separates from the atlas, and so it's no longer there. What's left is a little depression, and the depression is called the fovea dentis. Remember, fovea means pit. So when you look at the atlas, it has no body. It does have transverse foramina, and then it has this fovea dentis. Let's look at the axis. Remember, the body of the atlas separated during fetal development. Well, what it does is it becomes attached to this bone. It becomes attached here, and it looks a lot like a tooth sticking up, and so it's called the dens or odontoid process. Dens, like dental. So no other vertebra has anything like this. So this is unique. It also has transverse foramina. It has all those other body parts, but in addition, it has this dens. So that is C1 and C2, the atlas and the axis. And they're easy to tell apart from all those others because of these differences that they have. If you look at how these two fit together, you can see that the dens fits in the fovea dentis. And there's a ligament that goes across there and holds it in this place. The ligament's called the transverse ligament, and it creates a joint here between the atlas and the axis. And this joint is what allows us to rotate our head back and forth, like shaking your head no. So again, there's the atlas and the axis, and then here's a typical vertebra. So all the other vertebrae, nothing really unique about them except they all have these transverse foramina. Let's look at the thoracic vertebra. So again, they have their own unique characteristics. And you can see these in this table. You can also see a picture on the right. So we have a superior view and we have a lateral view. So let's look at thoracic vertebra. Remember, there are 12 of these, T1 to T12. Well, if you look at them, they look a little bit like a giraffe to me. You can see a long nose, you can see ears that stick out, you can see horns that kind of stick up. They look a little bit like a giraffe. Now, the further down you go, the less and less like a giraffe they look. But most of them have this giraffe-like appearance. But that's not the way to tell a thoracic vertebra from the others. Remember, only cervical vertebrae have those transverse foramina, so we're not going to see those. We are going to see all those body parts, though. We're going to see the body, the pedicles, the vertebral foramen, the transverse processes, the spinous process, all those things. We're also going to see the superior and inferior articulating processes, and they're different between thoracic and lumbar. The easiest way to tell these two apart is to look at these superior and inferior articulating processes. Well, if you compare them, they're different. If you look at the thoracic ones, they're flat. They're flat and they face the posterior position. But if you look at them in the lumbar one, they're curved. They're curved toward the medial surface. And you can see they're curved in. That is the easiest way to tell these apart. And you can see it in both the superior view and you can also see it in the lateral view. So thoracic vertebrae have flat superior and inferior articulating processes. Another thing about thoracic vertebrae is thoracic vertebrae where the ribs attach. And you can see where the ribs attach. Where the ribs attach, they form these little facets or divot-like things. It looks like someone took an ice cream scoop and just scooped out a little portion of the bone. If you look in this picture, you can see it very well because they painted them blue. So these are those little divot-like projections or concavities. It looks like someone did an ice cream scoop. There's one on the transverse process and there's one on the body. And this is how the rib fits together with that vertebra. And you can see that the rib attaches in two places. And so each place is going to have one of those facets. Let's look at lumbar vertebrae. So here are the characteristics of lumbar vertebra, and here you can see the superior and lateral pictures. Again, the easiest way to tell these apart is they don't look the same. So they don't look like giraffes at all. They look more like a moose. So a moose has sort of a square nose, and then you can see the ears and the horns up above. They also tend to have much bigger bodies. Remember, there are only 5 of these, and there are no ribs attached, so there are not going to be any facets. But again, the easiest way to differentiate between thoracic and lumbar is to look at these superior and inferior articulating processes. Remember, in thoracic, they're flat, but in lumbar, they're curved, and they're curved medially. And so we can see those very easily. If you look at the inferior ones, they're curved laterally. And so these interlock with each other as you stack them up. And this makes this area of the spine a little more secure. So, this table shows the characteristics of cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. You can compare the body, you can compare the spinous process, the vertebral foramen, the transverse processes, the superior and inferior articulating processes, and then it also tells you what kind of movements you can get at each of these vertebrae. If you put the vertebrae on top of each other, they create the vertebral column. But if you notice, the bones don't actually touch each other at the bodies. We have a disc in between, and the disc separates these vertebrae. It also holds them in alignment. There's also a hole that comes out between each vertebra. Remember, the word for hole is foramen. This is between vertebrae, so it's called the intervertebral foramen. And this is where the spinal nerves exit the spinal cord. We can also see this intervertebral disc. Again, this is fibrocartilage. And what it's going to do is cushion to keep these bones from banging into each other. It keeps them at the right distance of separation, and it also holds them in alignment. Let's look at the sacrum and the coccyx. Remember, these are fused bones. In children, the sacrum is 5 bones, and the coccyx in children is 4 bones. But fusion happens, and when you're an adult, the sacrum is 1 bone, and the coccyx is 1 bone. So here you can see both the sacrum and the coccyx. And again, there's no separation between these anymore. But you still can see where the old vertebrae used to be. And so even though they're not there anymore, we still use the terminology of S1 to S5 and CO1 to CO4. So let's look at the sacrum. So this is a posterior view. And if you look at the posterior view, the most obvious thing is that it has a tunnel that goes all the way through. This is the sacral canal. So this is what used to be the vertebral foramen, but again, when they're fused together, it creates a canal. The spinous processes are still here as well, but they're fused together to create the median sacral crest. You can also see holes. These used to be the intervertebral foramina, but now, because of the fusion, there's a whole separate hole, and these are called the sacral foramina. If you look at the very bottom, what you're going to see is an upside down U. And this is the termination of that sacral canal. It's called the sacral hiatus. If you flip the bone around and look at it from the anterior side, you can see most of those things, but not all. If you look at the coccyx, remember the coccyx is 4, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, even more vertebrae. They fuse together to form a single bone. And so when you look at these vertebrae, if you look at them in an unstacked, but in the position that they would occupy, the very top is the atlas, C1. Remember, it has no body. C2, remember the body has transferred itself there and it forms the dens. And so you can easily see the difference between these two. And then the next one is a typical cervical vertebra. And remember, the unique characteristic of cervical vertebrae is that they all have transverse foramina. The next one is a thoracic vertebra, and it has the 2 ribs attached. And again, you can see that the ribs attach in 2 places. They attach to the body of the vertebra and the transverse process. The next one is a lumbar vertebra. And even in this picture, you can see those curved superior articulating processes. And then finally, the last picture is the sacrum. And so you can see that sacral canal because we're looking at a superior view. Remember, I said that the coccyx can be either 3 or 4 or maybe more vertebrae. And so some children are actually born with a little tail. It's usually removed surgically and no one ever knows about it. But this is a baby that was born in India. And look, the tail is like a foot long. And so they did not remove the tail because they thought that this was a reincarnation of a deity. Let's look at the bony thorax, or the rib cage. So it looks like this. And so there's 3 parts to this. There's the sternum, there's the costal cartilages, which are hyaline cartilage, and then there are the ribs. We're not going to talk about the costal cartilages, but we are going to talk about the sternum and the ribs. So if we look at the sternum, it looks like this. You can see it here, and you can see the ribs, and those dark brown things are the costal cartilages. And so it forms what we call a rib cage. And that rib cage, or bony thorax, protects the heart and the lungs and some other organs as well. If you look at the sternum looks a lot like a man's tie. It has three sections to it. One section, which looks like the knot of a man's tie, is the manubrium. Another section, which looks like the long hanging part of a man's tie, that's called the body. And at the very bottom, there's a narrowed thing, which is called the xiphoid process. We also have notches on the sternum because things attach here. There's a notch right in the very center called the suprasternal notch. It's up at the top. It used to be called the jugular notch, and that's what it is in this picture. But that's an old name, and it's not used much anymore. Right next to that is the clavicular notches, and that's where the clavicles attach. And then running down all the sides, all the way down the body, are costal notches, where the ribs attach. So if you look here, this is the sternum. And again, we have these three parts. Manubrium, body, and xiphoid process. There's the manubrium, there's the body, and there's the xiphoid process. We also, remember, have these notches, and here you can see the bones that are actually attached. So up at the top, we have the two clavicles, and in between the clavicles, that's where the suprasternal notch is. The clavicles are attached in the clavicular notches, and the ribs are attached in the costal notches. Let's look at the rib cage. So if you look at the rib cage from the front, it looks like this, and we can see the sternum. If you look at it from the back, it looks like this. You can count the ribs in this picture. We have 12 pairs of ribs. And they're just numbered from 1 to 12, superior to inferior. Same thing here. We can count the ribs from 1 to 12, superior to inferior. Well, let's look at these ribs. Again, there are 12 pairs. They're different from each other, though, because of their attachment to the sternum. The first 7 are called vertebrosternal. Sometimes they're called true ribs. But they're called vertebrosternal because they go from the vertebrae in the spine all the way around, and they attach directly to the sternum. Now, of course, they attach by costal cartilages, but each rib has its own individual cartilage. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 are called vertebrochondral. Sometimes they're called false ribs. They also attach to the sternum, but they don't attach directly. They attach to a single piece of cartilage, and then that attaches to the sternum. So they're called vertebrochondral because they go from the vertebrae to cartilage. And then ribs 11 and 12 are called vertebral ribs. Sometimes they're called floating ribs. And the reason they're called vertebral is because they don't have an attachment to the sternum at all. So when we look at these ribs, we can see this. So again, the first 7 are vertebrosternal. And if you take a look at this, you can see that every vertebra has its own connection to the sternum. And then ribs 8, 9, and 10 are vertebrochondral. Again, they don't attach directly to the sternum. What they attach to is cartilage. And then the last ones, 11 and 12, they don't attach to the sternum at all. So in this, you can see these individual attachments and what they're connected to. Let's look at an individual rib. So ribs are flat bones. So this is a flat bone, and when you look at it, if you look at the two ends, the ends look different. One end, the one on the left, sort of looks just sort of chopped off or sawed off. That's the end that connects to the cartilage. The other end, the one on the right, you can see that there are bumps here. And this is the one that attaches to the vertebra. And you can see two places where they might attach. So if we look at the rib, the whole long flat part is called the shaft. If you look at the end where it attaches to the vertebra, we have a bump, which is called a tubercle. We have a neck, and we have a head, all right there together. The head and the tubercle are what attach to the vertebrae. The head attaches to the body of the vertebra, and the tubercle attaches to the transverse process. We also have a narrow place where blood vessels run. It's either called a sulcus or a groove, and it's called costal because it's rib. Again, blood vessels and nerves run right along this. So if we flip this around and look at it, you can see those exact things. Here, the head and the tubercle are easy to see. Again, the head attaches to the body of the vertebra. The tubercle attaches to the transverse process. You can also see the costal groove here very well. And the costal groove, again, is where blood vessels and nerves run along the bone. And then the rest of the bone is called the shaft. Once again, remember we have 12 pairs of ribs. The first 7, vertebrosternal, 8, 9, and 10, vertebrochondral, and 11 and 12, vertebral. The last part of this is the fetal skull. And so if you look at the fetal skull, immediately you should be able to tell that it looks different from the adult skull. If you look at the mandible or the jawbone, it's very reduced. But if you look at the skull, there's also something else different about it. It has soft spots. These soft spots are areas where the bone has not grown together. They're called fontanels, and there's 6 of these. There's an anterior, there's a posterior, there are 2 sphenoidals, one on each side, and 2 mastoidals, one on each side. So here is a sphenoidal, there's a mastoidal, there's the posterior, and there's the anterior. And so if you look at this, you should be able to look at it and see that these bones have not grown together. And this is not bony, it's membranous. And so if you remember back when we talked about how bones grow, this is intramembranous growth, and the bones have not extended through the membrane yet. Well, the purpose of this has to do with childbirth. So when we looked at the pelvis, remember we said the fetus passes through the pelvis, and usually it passes head first. Well, if the head were rigid and the pelvic cavity were just a little too small, it would become easily entrapped in there. But the head is not rigid, it's malleable. And so it can move around a little bit to aid in the movement through the birth canal. But again, we have an anterior and a posterior. These are the largest ones. And then we have the sphenoidal and the mastoidal. So 6 fontanels.